Many years ago, one evening, my wife and a close friend were going out for dinner to the Taj at about 8:30, and they were all sort of set to go out. My 13-year-old son grabbed his mother and said, "Mama, you cannot go. You stay home with me for dinner." And he was very persistent, so she called up the Taj and canceled their reservation. And it was just as well, because it turned out to be a life-saving decision, because it was the evening of 26/11 when terror descended onto Mumbai, including at the hotel where my wife would have been having dinner. And as I was watching the television that evening, I started to think, why is it that this can occur so easily in our country? Why is there a failure of the process on so many occasions? And in fact, you might remember that those few days across Mumbai and across the country, frankly, there was a lot of protests. There were people marching, protesting against the poor governance, against poor accountability, against poor public administration. And I think the feeling I got is that, yes, I do have the right to complain and protest, but I also felt that I had an obligation as a citizen to try to do something to improve the governance process. I was not sure what. A few days later, a close friend of mine was on a flight with me to Goa. He had escaped from the Taj early that morning, the night after the terrorist attacks, unhurt, but had a harrowing experience. So when I asked him, now that you've sort of survived that incident, how has it changed your life? And he said a very interesting thing. He said, I want to understand what can I do as an ordinary citizen to improve accountability in our country. And with that question, he launched me unknowingly onto a 3.5-year journey to understand governance and accountability in our country. Being a biologist by training, I knew nothing about political science, but I felt if I can characterize what accountability was, at least I would feel that I've done something as an ordinary citizen to help improve the public understanding of accountability. So here's what I found in my journey. In those 3.5 years, and by accident, the research ultimately became a book. But during that process, many more incidences of poor governance were visible. You all remember the Commonwealth Games scam. You may also remember the coal scam, the telecom scam. And I started to think that India is now probably at its most critical juncture in its post-independence history. Because it was not the Taj under siege, but I felt it was accountability which was under siege. And through that process, I could see that, well, there were people I talked to did not have a clear understanding of what accountability meant. And so my journey was to try to increase that understanding. What I learned is that governance is the heart of any country, but accountability is its heartbeat. Without accountability, you cannot have good governance. And if you explore governance and you try to study it, it's qualitatively and quantitatively measurable. You can measure governance. It's much more difficult to measure accountability. You can only measure it through intangible understanding of the mechanisms of accountability. And I then started looking at the system using my biology background from a systems perspective, and I realized that this is very complex. Governance as a system interacts with the political system, with the social system, with the economic system. So if you change something in one of those systems, there could be a positive or negative impact on the other system. So it's systems dynamics at play. And that's important because obviously governance will then have an impact on many other areas in the way in which a country operates. So I asked the question, is India too young a democracy to really expect good governance? We've been around democracy for maybe 65 years around that time. Now it's 70 years. And when I did an analysis of a large number of countries, looking at, on one axis, at the age of the democracy on the x-axis, and the quality of governance on the y-axis, I found an interesting shape. If you look at the graph, you will see that somewhere where India is around 65, 70 years, you find that India is way below other countries of similar democratic age. India's governance level is not as good as other countries which are around 65, 70 years old. So there's a lot of catch up that we need to do. Then I asked the question, how does governance impact the competitiveness of a country? And when I did the correlation between a global competitiveness index and governance, I found the correlation to be 0.83, which means it's extremely high. Essentially, good governance and being competitive as a country move in exactly the same direction. We don't know what causes what, but they move in the same direction. So, if you are a country which has good governance, there's a good chance you'll be very competitive. If you have poor governance, you will not be competitive. What impact does governance have on the human condition? So I looked at the Human Development Index, and I actually found the correlation once again to be extremely high. Those countries that have good governance tend to have very good human development indicators. Their social condition, the human condition is in good shape. In those countries where governance is weak, the human condition is also weak. So therefore it impacts your social systems also. I also was wondering, how does the social hierarchy that exists in India impact governance? Now, social hierarchy is the inequity in power and wealth between individuals. India, as you know, has a very high social hierarchy, which means if I'm at the bottom of the pool in terms of equity, how can I ever extract accountability or expect good governance from a public official who is supposedly at a higher level in power and wealth? And that correlation really worried me because it's inversely correlated. The greater your social hierarchy, the worse your governance will be. And India is among those countries where hierarchy is extremely high, and that's developed over 2,000 years. There's a lot of discussion today about the shadow economy. India has about maybe 25% of its economy is a shadow economy, maybe more. But the correlation again is very strong. If you have a large shadow economy, you are likely to have poor governance. So any attempt to reduce the shadow economy is actually going to help improve governance in some way. There's also discussion about digital evolution. Now, if you look at this graph, it shows you that those countries that are digitally evolved, you compare them to the quality of governance, the correlation is almost 0.9, which means those countries that employ a large number of digital transactions are quite likely to have much better governance. So there is something to be said for pushing digital usage across the country. So that's governance. So if you look at accountability, like I said, accountability is the heartbeat of good governance. Accountability is more measured on the basis of mechanisms of accountability. There are two kinds. One which concerns everybody in this room, which is what we call external accountability. It's the pressure that citizens, civil society, and media exerts on the government institutions. The other is the internal accountability which government organizations have within. From our research, I concluded that the most important thing to shift any system or any country from its equilibrium is external pressure from outside. Internal changes from within the government are much more difficult. They have their own political considerations. It takes much more time. So the external pressure that people like us apply, which we also applied during those years when there was an anti-corruption movement in India, if you remember. And I think that has a dramatic impact on a country's decision to push its accountability up and to push its governance up. From my work, I found that there are 6 broad things that any country can do to improve its accountability and therefore improve its governance. And for India, for example, information which you provide, which the government provides in terms of being transparent is very critical. Being impartial, that is impartial in terms of selection of public officials, focus on implementation, not just on how much money are you allocating to a scheme, but really what was the outcome of that allocation. Infrastructure, so improving essentially the infrastructure of the courts, the judiciary is absolutely critical, and independence. Even public officials within the government need to be given freedom to make sure they're independent of interference from the political executive. But I think the most important thing really is the last one, that is involvement. That is involvement of people like you and me in the political process, not only when we vote, but also in the intervening period. And so if you're an ordinary citizen, if you're a student, if you're working in a corporation, what can you do to improve accountability? That was the question that my friend who escaped from the Taj asked me. So there are 6 things you can do. So first of all, 5 things. First, you can provide your time. Spend a few hours a week, a few hours on weekends, helping civil society organizations who are very well organized and already doing their bit to improve governance in the country. You can provide your media support, which is, if you have access to media, through social media or regular media, you can provide that support to them. You can also provide your intellectual capability. So if you're a company, if you're a college, you have great intellectual resources available to you, and civil society organizations don't have access to that. So if you increase their institutional capacity to push the governance initiative, that makes a big difference. Infrastructure, a college like this, or if you're working in a company, classrooms on weekends, or in the evenings, or office space on weekends, and if you give that to a civil society organization to simply come in and work, that helps them tremendously to fight their battle. And lastly, of course, you can provide monetary support. But these are the 5 things which you as ordinary citizens can do to help improve accountability in our country. So let me walk you through the journey of accountability over the last 10 years. Since 2008, we actually felt that accountability was dropping. Because why was that the case? Because the external accountability pressure that citizens were putting on the government institutions were enormous. So coupled with the media, coupled with civil society, we were putting a lot of pressure on the government. And therefore, more scams were being exposed. If we had not put that pressure, those scams would not have been exposed. As a result, our perception was that accountability is dropping continuously. Corruption and governance in India is becoming worse and worse. But that pressure resulted, frankly, in 2014 in a complete change of administration in our country. And if you remember, the platform on which the new government came in was claimed to be that of providing great governance. It was the pressure that we put that actually caused that. Over the last few years, I believe that accountability has begun to improve. There is much greater pressure, much greater transparency, and accountability has begun to improve. And I think that today we're in a much better position than we were way back in 2008. And I feel that in the next 5 or 7 years, accountability will continue to improve. But it can only improve if people like you and me do our bit. It's no point complaining. We have an obligation as citizens of India to do something to try and improve the quality of governance. And I think it's important to remember the words of the father of the nation. If you want to make some change, you better be part of that change process. It's no point just saying that things should improve. It's not going to improve unless you are actively involved. And I think that if we all do that as ordinary citizens, whether you're a student, whether you're in a company, I think we will ultimately make sure that India meets its tryst with destiny. Thank you.